Of Reddit, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? We learned about this is a school. In the 1950s in Borneo, they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars, thatch that people's homes were made of, and thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which was eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't, and the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem lead to cats being airdropped into Borneo. Wow, this one is awesome. But you would think they would have already learned not to fuck with the ecosystem. I mean, I'm sure most countries have tried and failed. The Australian cane toad chain event comes to mind. The events that led and culminated in the War of the Bucket for sure. Essentially, one Italian state who followed Holy Roman Emperor stole a bucket from another Italian state who followed the Pope. War broke out, the papal state highly outnumbered the HRE state, but HRE state won. Then stole another bucket. Was a trip for sure when I learned about this one. So, the Han heard the kin were fond of mega projects and massive infrastructure investments, so they found a hydraulics engineer and sent him over to sell them on an absurd canal idea: build a massive canal to use runoff water from two flood-prone rivers to irrigate worthless plains. Tame the river's flooding, irrigate wasteland, everybody wins. And in the Han's schemes, it's an absurdly large project that will keep the kin diverted and invested for decades. And it does. Except about halfway through, the kin cotton onto this and confront their hydraulics engineer, Zhang, presumably confronted with whatever creative things they do to spies and saboteurs, throws himself on keen mercy. Yeah, I'm a spy. Yeah, it was to sabotage your efforts, but I'm really an engineer, guys, and this will really work. Honest. Let me finish it, and please don't do the thing with the cheese grater. The kin, presumably, conclude they can always torture him to death later, and let him remain in charge of the project. And wonder of wonders, it works. Thousands of hectares or rich but fallow desert are turned into fertile farmland. Existing farmland is made safer by giving the flooding rivers runoff channels. The canal makes the kin rich beyond their already immense wealth, which they turn to larger armies, eventually crushing the Han and, briefly, uniting China. That reminds me of the story of how a Chinese engineer named Ziman Bao proved religion is a con and abolished human sacrifice in China. Ziman Bao was an engineer and a rationalist who lived during the Warring States period in China. He served as a magistrate for the Marquis Wen, who ruled the territory of Wei from 445 BC to 396 BC. During that time, the province of Yi, in what is now Hebei, began to decline and falter. The Marquis sent Ziman Bao to find out what was wrong. Ziman Bao visited the main town of Yi on the river Jiang. He was dismayed to find the fertile countryside depopulated. Whole families were fleeing productive farms and leaving the rich land fallow. The peasants feared the capricious god of the river, who could cause flooding and death, or alternately drought and starvation, but they feared the crushing taxes imposed upon them by the regional governor even more. Most of all, they feared a local witch who selected maidens from the area as the brides for the river. Chosen girls were dressed in finery and tightly bound to sumptuously decorated floating platforms, which were then sunk. These human sacrifice extravaganzas were the purported cause of the high taxes as well. The governor levied annual taxes for the ceremony and then kept a majority of the proceeds for himself and his cronies. People who complained discovered that their daughters were chosen as brides. Upon finding this out, Ziman Bao arrived at one of the marriage celebrations with a troop of Wei soldiers. As the ceremony started, He proclaimed the girl unworthy of the river god. He commanded the witch to go down to the riverbed and ask the river god whether the previous brides had been satisfactory. When she began to equivocate, the soldiers threw her into the river, where she quickly sank beneath the current. When the witch didn't return, Zeman asked the governor's cronies to see what was taking her so long. The soldiers then threw them in the river to drown as well. Zeman Bao sarcastically suggested that the witch and the officials were having lunch with the river god. He was about to send the regional governor to fetch them when the government fell to his knees and begged forgiveness for the scheme. Zeman Bao stripped the governor of position and holdings, and then probably tortured him to death as was customary at the time. He used the prescribed wealth to build a series of dams and irrigation canals to bring the unruly river under control. Zeman Bao is still revered for being the first Chinese official to tame a river by means of civil engineering, cunning administration, and, above all, the ability to see that religion was a con trick, pretty much the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR was already crumbling by this point, and so they agreed to allow the wall to be opened for a bit. Well, the guy in charge over in Berlin didn't he really get the point across to the public very well, and as a result everyone assumed that the wall was permanently coming down. This led to pretty much all of East Berlin flocking to the wall and demanding to be let through. The guards there knew there was no way to restrain all these people without a massacre occurring, and the Russian government had no real way of easily fixing the huge mistake. And so the Berlin Wall fell. All because of a misinterpretation. Honestly, Cambyses' life in general is one of the weirder chapters of antiquity. I am thinking specifically of, in Herodotus' version of events, how Cambyses, emperor of Persia, killed his brother. Basically, the story goes as follows. Cambyses, emperor and son of Cyrus, goes crazy. He has his brother, Bardiya, killed but, crucially, keeps it a secret. After some other crazy and or incestuous antics, news spreads across the Persian Empire that Bardiya, son of Cyrus, has risen in revolt against his brother. Did you catch the problem? Bardiya should be dead, Cambyses had him assassinated. As the story goes, a very confused Cambyses starts riding off to squish Bardiya's rebellion, but dies in a freak accident involving an infected wound. One Persian catches wind of the fishiness surrounding this Bardiya figure, who is now ruling as the new emperor of Persia, and, to make a long story short, kills the usurper and takes power. This Persian is rather famous, his name is Darius. The wonky thing is that we hear all of this story thanks to Darius' personal propaganda department, which begs the question, was the Bardiya that Darius killed actually an impostor? Did Darius kill the rightful emperor, lying about it? If he did, the entire story rests on the weirdness surrounding Cambyses' personality. Nixon created a chain of events that I find hard to believe. So in 1968 Lyndon Johnson is president, has a Democrat, and the Democrats are having issues. The party is majorly split up between segregation issues, and they hate the Vietnam War that the country is stuck in. Nixon starts promising to end the draft, and he also proclaimed that he had a plan to end the war. Just before the election that year, on Halloween, a Thursday, LBJ gets on the news, and declares that the war is almost over, and peace is at hand. The North Vietnamese were participating in peace talks, and all war activity had been suspended. They left the peace talks because Nixon himself told them that if they kept the war going for one extra week, he would offer them a better deal once he was in power. So by Saturday, the North Vietnamese had walked out of the peace talks, and the war was back on. The election on the next Tuesday went to Nixon, but barely. The war continued for another 5 years. And in that time 15,000 Americans died, as well as who knows how many Vietnamese. LBJ knew about it at the time, because he had wiretapped the South Vietnamese ambassador as well as several others, and felt he could not reveal the extent of the wiretapping that Americans were guilty of. Even if it meant Nixon got away with treason. I assumed, and Wikipedia confirmed, that Op was talking about Guatemala. It's a really tragic story, but essentially, United Fruit Co. didn't like the newly elected president of Guatemala for advocating land reform policies which would harm United Fruit Co.'s bottom line. This is where Bernays comes in. He devised a strategy to portray the leader as a pro-communist and therefore a threat to the US, who didn't want communism anywhere in the Americas. This wasn't exactly true, but the Guatemalan president was left-leaning. This portrayal as communist encroachment in the Americas gave the CIA the leeway they needed politically to institute a regime change, aka perform a coup d'état in Guatemala and replace the president with someone more aligned with U.S. business interests broadly and United Fruit Co.'s in particular. Unfortunately for the Guatemalan people, this was awful. But hey, we got cheap bananas in the 50s and a fruit company maintained that sweet money. Fuck Bernays, lots of proper nouns and hazy memory, but here goes. Gangsters running illegal gambling ring arrested. Finds out that Rep for Nature Republic, Chung, was involved in gambling. Chung appoints his lawyer. Investigations reveal that the rep lobbied, bribed lot for location of duty-free stores. Additional investigations reveal lot had massive slush fund. Chung and his lawyer, for Nature Republic, starts fighting over how the lawyer will be paid. Lawyer gets arrested for breaking lawyer law. Chung's colleague reveals that Chung gambled illegally a lot more before, and was acquitted in the past. The past cases dealing with Chung's gambling problems was dealt by Hong. Investigations on Hong begins. Turns out Hong did a lot of dirty work for Chung. Investigations reveal Hong emailing Chung about having the custody of the Secretary of Civil Affairs, Wu. Chosen Daily, while investigating a separate case dealing with Nixon's bribery, finds connection between the Secretary of Civil Affairs Nixon. Real estate fraud? The Blue House, Korean White House, gets pissed because their secretary was accused of a crime, and accuses the Chosen Daily as corrupt. Chosen Daily gets pissed and reveals that the Blue House forced Sports and Mir Foundation to force many companies to bribe the Blue House, pretty much extortion. Blue House gets pissed and reveals that editor-in-chief for Chosen Daily got bribed by DSME. Chosen Daily steps down. Different newspaper reveals that the mastermind behind Sports and Mir Foundation was a woman called Choi. Investigations reveal Choi's daughter got into her college via Choi's power. Choi's relationship with President of Korea revealed. Choi's computer was seized, fine drafts for the president's speeches. Turns out that she's the one editing and approving the president's speeches and political actions. Yes, classified information that the only president is supposed to know was on her PC. Choi was controlling the president the entire time. Choi was daughter of a cult leader. The president was in deep relationship with the said cult leader in the past. Choi and president had sisterly relationship. President relied on Choi for everything. Basically, the country was being run by a cult.
The 80-Year War, commonly known in the rest of the world as all the shit that happened before the 30-Year War, was the Dutch struggle for independence. Due to typical medieval fuckery, the King of the Netherlands wasn't some Dutch guy, but Philip II of Spain. Slight problem, the Dutch provinces were major centers of Protestantism, which was kind of awkward for the staunchly Catholic Philip. Trying to impress that fact led to a rebellion, and it turns out that fighting swamp people on their own turf can get really messy. The entire war was full of crazy shit and saw the Dutch Republic go from a bunch of pirates on riverboats to one of the most powerful empires of the day. The entire thing didn't go well for Spain. But one of the most downright crazy things were the Hellburners. The Spanish held Antwerp, and one crazy plan we don't like to talk about failed. That was the Finbellis, a ridiculously expensive littoral combat vessel, siege platform that, in true form to ships named through hubris, was incapable of doing what it was designed for. But there was another plan. The British, in support of their Protestant brethren, had hired an Italian inventor to help the rebels. This man came up with a simple, but batshit crazy plan: make 2 giant floating bombs, and use them to blow up the ship bridge preventing entry to Antwerp. These were the Hellburners, 2 cargo vessels that were modified with a huge blast chamber in the hold. It consisted of brick walls filled with gunpowder, closes off with headstones on top. This was surrounded by all manner of shrapnel. One used a traditional fuse, while the other used a novel clockwork fuse. When they were deployed against the ship bridge, they were set alight as normal fire ships. One ran aground, while the other struck its target. Initially, the Spanish response was dismissive. Converting normal ships to fire ships is something people only did in extreme times of need, and there were only 2 of them. Soldiers rushed to put out the fire, and they thought that would be it. Then these motherfuckers exploded. The blast killed 800 Spanish on the spot and obliterated the bridge. But as so often happens with experimental military technology, the rebels weren't expecting quite this success, and failed to capitalize on it. The Spanish held Antwerp, would hold on to the Spanish Netherlands, which would eventually become Belgium. But the story doesn't end there. Soon after, the Spanish embarked on a little trip you might have heard of. La Armada Invincible. Clearly, they had not learned the lesson of their success against the Finbellis. The purpose of the Armada was to land troops in England, show them who's boss, and knock them out of the war. This wasn't a crazy idea, as the British land forces were kind of shit. Of course, what followed was a successful naval action of the British against the Spanish, and one of the most resounding naval defeats in history. However, the opening volley of the battle was quite desperate. The British converted old cargo ships to fire ships and launched them at the Spanish fleet, which was in close formation. The Spanish fleet promptly scattered and was picked apart. Nobody really knows for sure, but the fact that the Spanish had just had a large amount of ships obliterated by a superweapon that looked exactly like what the British fleet deployed, which they knew was built by someone in service to the British Crown. Well, that's an interesting coincidence, isn't it?
If Gavrilo Princip never stopped for a snack at that cafe, he never would have shot Franz Ferdinand. That would have never started World War I with the particular political alliances of the moment. Which meant Russia wouldn't have been ground into dust by Germany economically while Germany lost the war. Which means communism never would have taken hold in Russia, while Nazism wouldn't even exist. Which means World War II and the Cold War would have never happened. No Cold War means no American involvement in Vietnam. Which led to the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Hippies. Disgusting dirty hippies. Edit. In all seriousness, in response to the people saying it would have happened regardless, I do believe that's true. But what I also think is that it wouldn't have happened the way it did or if Princip didn't spark the powder keg when he did. Which is why I noted the particular political alliances of the moment. Here's why. Britain and France had just stopped literally 1,000 years of animosity rooted in Roman times. World War I is what cemented the modern alliance. The US was continuing to grow as an economic superpower. Russia just had the shit slapped out of them by Japan and was collapsing without the war either way. Franz Ferdinand himself was petitioning his government to be nicer to the Serbs specifically because he saw this mess coming. Turkey was trying to figure out how to secure itself with Russia looming over them, trying to get themselves a port that was accessible in winter. A bunch of nations like Greece and Serbia had just thrown off the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian yoke, who's to say more wouldn't have. If we postpone World War I just 10 years in the future, it could have turned out with very different alliance structures.